As I look out across the audience, I realize that I think almost every one of you here today has had the great pleasure of attending the performances of Refuse the Hour at Yale Repertory Theater over the last couple of days. And I just want to give thanks again to our great colleagues at the Yale Rep for presenting that wonderful production. Also to give thanks to the Yale School of Music, the Institute of Sacred Music, and our wonderful museum colleague, the Yale Center for British Art, who today, with the University Art Gallery, are about to invite William Kentridge up here to give one of our Andrew Carnduff Ritchie lectureships. I should just say that William has already demonstrated in this week that once having received an honorary doctorate from Yale, he's taken seriously what it means to be an alumnus of this institution, and has given not only of his artistic production and exhibits of work collected by the gallery here since the year 2000, a tremendous amount of himself, his collaborators, and as you know, shared two wonderful after-performance discussions with us. So today he's going to deliver one of our Ritchie lectures, and this lectureship was established by Jane Ritchie in honor of her husband, Andrew, who was a distinguished director of the gallery years ago, and it's something that Amy Myers, who's here in the audience today, and Jules Brown and I get to deliberate every year, and it allows us to invite very distinguished artists and scholars from around the world to come to Yale and present their work or to do research. So, William, in that regard, know that it's a deep, deep pleasure for us to invite you up here to deliver a Ritchie lectureship and learn more about the wonderful ways in which you create the art you do with so many wonderful and rich collaborators. William Kentridge, everybody.
What happens at the edges? Today I'm meant to be talking about what happens at the margins of projects, but I somehow can't stop thinking about mangoes. I mean, let it be said, when I wrote these lecture notes, it was the season of mangoes in Johannesburg, and the kitchen where I was working was filled with their sweet and overripe smell. I was thinking about the correct way to eat a mango. In my childhood, you were always told to eat the mango in the bath. And you had to have a face cloth to wipe your face, and your fingernails had to be not too short so you could pull the fibers out from between your teeth. Now, in my family, in our family, we make lists. We make lists of the best film of one person or the worst film of another, the best fruit, the worst fruit, the best author, the worst author. Now, mangoes are my daughter's best fruit, and mangoes are my father's worst fruit. Now, I'm aware that this is of no interest or purpose whatsoever, but what I'm doing is trying to track a series of thoughts wherever they go, and here also clearly resisting the need to make a coherent argument. To offer an explanation of the themes of this lecture, these notes were written in the studio and in the kitchen in Johannesburg in anticipation of this lecture, and I was kind of trying to keep track of life in the studio and to keep a list on track also of all the other ideas that were hovering in my head apart from the mango. So there was a vase of peonies in the studio, there was a second vase of peonies in the studio, there was a drawing of a sparrow, of a Eurasian tree sparrow, in fact. And the sparrows were hovering as an idea. There was a sense of a vague image of ink and paper coming towards each other to meet. Let it be said that I'm very bad at focusing on a single idea. But somehow I have to rescue this insufficient and porous focus. So I will latch on to any stray image that comes into the studio in the hope that at some point that will lead to a more coherent idea. So on the walls of the studio there was a drawing of an enamel water jug. There was a drawing of the expulsion of Pope Clement in 1440. There was a portrait of the composer Alban Berg and his wife and his mistress. There were pages of a Chinese dictionary. There were photos of the political rally in Dar es Salaam, pages from a newspaper of the Paris Commune in 1871. One of the extracts pinned up on the wall of the studio reads, "We announce the death in Paris of Monsieur Barroyer, a baritone in the National Opera. Monsieur Barroyer possessed a very curious collection of paintings, ancient and modern, well appreciated by connoisseurs. Monsieur Barroyer died playing dominoes." The same newspaper, this newspaper from the Paris Commune of 1871, reports from the Grahamstown Journal in South Africa of 1871 that a diamond of 119 carats of the clearest color had been found in South Africa. I mean, we could easily spend the next hour here just with me reading you different extracts from this extraordinary newspaper of 1871. But circling the studio, there is this persistent peripheral vision of images on the walls of the studio. You can stop walking and study each image, but you can also just continue the circling of the studio, aware of these different images and cutouts and photostats as you go around. And they're kind of reminders of that which you are not focused on, the things at the edges. But there's also a parallel thing that is happening to the peripheral vision, and that is a kind of peripheral thinking. Ideas which are pushed aside by other ideas as you're walking around, ideas that are at the edges but not central to the focus of what you're doing. The visual intrusions are obviously central to every studio. The pinboard of ideas and half-completed projects are obviously vital, but the visual intrusions can also be thought of as a demonstration, as a model of what these insistent peripheral thoughts are. I try to fix on one thought, but then I realize that the fixing of that thought becomes impossible. So I look at a tree, and I try to focus on this tree for 5 minutes to record the different thoughts that arise. And here I'm interested in the very porousness of focus, that one tries to focus on one thing, but other thoughts keep coming in. There's the tree in the garden, which is a white stinkwood tree I'm looking at. Then I think of the roughness of the bark and a memory of the rough bark of a mulberry tree as a child hanging by my legs from it. I think of the branches of the tree are like a brachy of a lung. I think of the sunlight on a leaf. I think of the suicide of Virginia Woolf, because Virginia Woolf wrote once that the brightest thing in the world is sunlight on a leaf. Then I think of the tree as a gibbet, and then the uses of a tree, the pencil, the table, the plain planks of a coffin. So then I can think of West Park Cemetery, the Johannesburg Cemetery. Then there were 4 private thoughts, which will remain private. I think of shrapnel in the wood. I have a Swedish friend who's a carpenter and a shipbuilder, and he complained of having to use German oak because he said it was still all so full of fragments of shrapnel from the Second World War, a kind of 70 years on a natural history still growing in the trees. Then I think of the beech forests of Buchenwald. I can think of a kind of the pollarded trees of the First World War, a kind of botanical xenophobia. And then the tree as it stands, a prisoner in the garden, it's 53 years of growing. I think of a barrel bomb in Aleppo. Think of our internal tree in which we grow our own death. I mean, the list could go on. This is all the thoughts that come into one's head while focusing on the tree. And we each would have different sets of ideas or associations. So one can see that every encounter with the world is a mixture of that which comes towards us, which the world brings to us, and that which we project onto it. So the tree can never just be the tree itself. Our biography, our memories, our thoughts are part of what it is to see the tree. To be schematic, we could say that the tree is the center and that all these other thoughts are at the periphery, coming down to sit down and weigh down or crack the branches of the tree. That which seems extraneous cannot be kept out of the center. Now, in the studio, this is even more obvious, not just the ideas released by the tree, but how the tree is seen and how it is represented. One thinks of drawing the tree in with a good brush and a bad brush. And the good brush and the bad brush meet the ink in the paper in the making of the tree in the studio. So a good brush will keep its controlled line and point, and the bad brush, which has lost its point, in itself seems to suggest the roughness and the profusion either of bark or of foliage. And so from these two brushes themselves comes both the possibility and also the desire and the need to make a whole forest. Now there is a Zen mindfulness which will say that exclude everything that is not the tree itself. But I would suggest that to do that is in fact to remove the tree itself. We put a pin into a sheet of paper, you pull a string against the central point, and you can describe a circle. Now this is the line that defines the edges, the periphery. That is that which is outside the line is the periphery. And the periphery is made as a pressure against the center, a force against the center. So you think in Paris of the périphérique, and you think of the 20 arrondissements in the center, and the banlieue outside, and the separation between them. And in South Africa, this is even more clear, the separation between the center and the periphery. The city center, which are surrounded by the townships and the informal settlements. And the truth of the center is always only comprehensible in relation to that which is outside of it. More than that, the meaning of the center is made by the periphery. And however much financiers may wish to think the heart of it is just in Wall Street and in their banks and in Johannesburg Stock Exchange, but the most cursory examination, or the most cursory thought, will show the dependence on that center of that which is excluded from it, that which is outside it. In South Africa, our gold mining industry has always had to be subsidized by the subsistence farming in the rural economy that paid for the families of the miners themselves. So in the studio, to bring it back into the studio, this is not only elements of images that structure around it, but the way that images from outside, from what you're not thinking of, migrate into the center and in the end become the heart of what that central image or that central concern is. And the art is to not defend the center, but to be open that which appears to be extraneous. The tree is never just its own tree. The painting of peonies or a jug of flowers always leads to things outside of that jug of flowers. And we have to acknowledge that the act of seeing is always a negotiation between that which comes towards us and that which we project onto it. And our understanding of history also, idiosyncratic, particular, is always shaped by our biography. Not even necessarily our whole biography, but some moment that connects to a historical story and makes sense of it. And then, knowing how unstable our knowledge really is, that it's always constructed out of these contingent details, we try to shore it up by finding points of agreement with other people as if it has a stability that we would hope to rely on. Now, the periphery and its migration into the center is the subject that I'm interested in this lecture today. And I want to look at this question in relation to a project which I've been working on for the last couple of years, which are a series of projections and images made for an exhibition in Beijing that happened a couple of months ago. In South Africa, it's fair enough to say that China and the presence of China hovers over us like this huge zeppelin. The scale of it, the scale of its hunger for resources, the scale of everything. I mean, Africa in China today is a series of questions rather than clear answers. Are we like a tethered goat in a forest waiting for the tiger to come and devour us whole? Are we just easy pickings? What is the nature of this imbalance of power between China and its presence around Africa? So this is one of the goads, one of the thoughts of being interested in a project about China. But the project itself began as an invitation to show a selection of work in a museum in Beijing. And so curiosity about China and flattery about being asked are certainly part of the equation. I thought, what was it in my work that might interest people in China? And I wanted to both find a link to that other world and to make a project for that exhibition that would address that. And everything was possible: drawing, sculpture, film, all was possible. And so the project began, as many do, in a kind of distracted, non-specific reading different books that came my way that people suggested, articles. I read the books of Lu Xun, the great modernist writer, whose modernist sensibility placed him very close to a Japanese writer like Akutagawa, or European writers of the absurd like Gogol or Kafka. I looked at books of revolutionary posters. Here I was immediately struck by the language, by the exhortation, the instructions, the clamor of indescribable and unstoppable enthusiasm. So these texts, these exhortations become one starting point for the project. I mean, there are obvious slogans like proletarians of the world unite, work hard for the electrification of agriculture, crush the four olds, build a great wall of steel, burn the enslaving contract, contribute more typewriters, eat bitterness, study carefully, smash the ox devils, less brocade on the jacket, more fuel in winter, the greater the hardship, the greater the hardship. Then there was another starting point. So that became one, that sat in already, these phrases started gathering on the walls of the studio. Another starting point was some videos of the model operas that I was shown. And these were model operas, revolutionary operas, performed during the period of the Great Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, which is from when I was 11 to when I was 21 years old. Now, the model operas were theatre pieces of exemplary revolutionary content, the form of Peking operas reworked with revolutionary stories. And through a passionate speech, a young peasant or a young communist soldier would exhort the village around him to rise up to resist the Kuomintang or the Japanese. And so at the end there'd be a great revolutionary moment, red flags are waved, action stops and you sing the Internationale, and then the martial arts and the opera continues. And seeing these films became the serious starting point of the project. To remind ourselves of the Cultural Revolution itself, we remember that it was a huge upheaval in China from 1966 to 1976, in which the youth of China, under the slogan, "It is right to rebel," turned against authority figures who were seen to have abandoned the revolutionary path and become enmeshed in a world of bourgeois consumption and aspiration. And the students were encouraged in this action by Mao himself. But the Cultural Revolution could also be described as a huge upheaval in China, provoked by a power struggle at the top, on the top ranks of the party, in which the students and then soldiers were used to bolster political positions and to contest opposing viewpoints as to the future direction of Chinese society. Now, here already we have a gap in the center as to what the nature of it was, which is the correct description of the Cultural Revolution. And this is not only a question of interpretation by commentators and historians. At its center, it is a contestation also. It's not as if outside on the periphery there is interpretation and in the center there is truth. Events are always constructed by the meeting of interpretation and understanding, not just by observers, but by the participants themselves. So the truth is always a provisional truth about what is happening right in the center. And these political battles are the center of the upheaval. But for me in the studio, it was in fact all the things at the edges that caught my attention and that became the way of looking at this absent center of the conflict. There was the paraphernalia, the ephemera of the action, the huge hand-drawn newspapers which were put up on the walls of streets in Beijing and other cities of China, in which members of the party were accused of corruption and different arguments and polemical battles were fought. But in fact, it was the model operas that held me. I began the project with a notebook labeled Notes Towards a Model Opera. And the project itself began with a series of improvisations with the South African dancer Dada Masilo, that some of you would have seen yesterday in the performance at the Yale Theatre of Refuse the Hour. And we'd worked before together on Refuse the Hour, and I invited her in and showed her some of the videos of the model opera, and we had an hour of improvisation on the dance floor, in which there were strangenesses and unexpected connections that emerged in that first hour that showed me we needed to continue. We looked at some of the dance from the Chinese model operas and listened to it with 1950 South African dance music, with colonial dance bands, and it was already clear the project should not be abandoned, even though it was unclear then, and to some extent is unclear now, quite how the full expanded piece would look or what it would mean. But to walk around the project and to talk about some of the peripheral ideas that were there. Here is a photograph taken by the South African photographer David Goldblatt in 1978 in a town outside Johannesburg of Boksburg, a young ballet dancer on the veranda of her house under a pergola. Now, what holds us, what held me when I first saw it in 1981? Of course, we're astonished by the tutu and the point shoes on that hard veranda, but also by the beatific expression on the young girl's face, and kind of an ecstatic dream of, even as I dance, I dream of dancing. The dream of being the prima ballerina assoluta, of dancing with Rudolf Nureyev, and on the other side of the stage in Swan Lake and Giselle. And one thinks how these dreams crash. And it's not so much the pergola that crashes down on the dancer, it is that harsh Johannesburg direct winter sunlight. And I would describe this photograph as merciless. There's no place to protect this dream of Europe in it. And we're here in this photograph, the end of this long string stretching from the ballet centers of Paris and Moscow, swung in an arc that reaches from Johannesburg to Adelaide to Shanghai, a kind of longing for another world. Now, while this does not quite go back to the bathtub and the mango, it does go back to our house and to my memory of my sister's ballet lessons, to her hopes, to the practice bar she had in the playroom. So when I see the Chinese dancer on point, all this comes back. There's a kind of an absurdity of fighting the Japanese on point, of learning how to throw a hand grenade on point, of charging through enemy machine guns on point. It is absurd, but there's also a kind of strange beauty. I mean, there's beauty in the dancing and the ensemble work, in the perfect coordination, and there's also a kind of a sadness of the impossible hopes of Boksburg. In our house, a sense of a gap, a grief. But also there are surprising connections. So we think of ballet. This is a French art form which was perfected in Russia, and it wins out in the cultural battles of the Soviet Union. So it's the Bolshoi ballet that becomes the flag bearer of Soviet culture rather than the modernism of Akarova or even Diaghilev. So it's a conservative victory. And the Chinese model operas used to become the revolutionary new also hang on to this conservative 19th century form of ballet. So there's an unbridgeable gap between what is being made on stage and what was happening outside the theaters and cinemas. Also, we can't quite avoid the specifics of dancing on point. The violence done to the feet, a kind of a modern kind of foot binding that happens. In this case, I remember back in Johannesburg, the tears, the blood, the cotton wool, the methylated spirits used to try to repair my sister's feet as she tried to push them into that impossible pair of shoes, into those Cinderella ballet pumps. So how do we start to put these different things together? Johannesburg, the dancing in Johannesburg, in Paris, in Beijing, the wish and impulse to be other than we are, this wish and impulse that demands to be heard. But to take it again one stage further out from the center, the great model opera of the period, or the most popular one, was a ballet which still gets performed, called The Red Detachment of Women. It was a cast almost entirely of women, and there was a pleasure reported by many people from China at the time of the rare opportunity of being able to look at naked thighs with a clear revolutionary conscience. Now, the libido is seldom referred to in revolutionary or other political theory, but the edges show that it is there. Desire is never far from the studio, the theater, or the Politburo. Mao's priapism, his lovers, are not part of the official discourse, but they're there. The connection between the biographical and the grand statement has to be looked at. All of these float at the edge of the big question, the meaning of the great proletarian cultural revolution. The biographical, Mao's biography, my biography looking at it. The periphery longing for the center. The line of connection between Johannesburg and Shanghai. The balance between the edges, ironic or not. The great swell of pride also that came over the viewers of these revolutionary operas when they saw the triumph of their forces over the Kuomintang, over the Japanese. And the desire and the need to hold together hope and disillusion. This is the seventh peripheral thought. Peripheral thoughts 5 and 6 I'm still waiting to arrive. And this is a peripheral thought that preceded the main event of the Cultural Revolution. In 1958, as part of the Great Leap Forward, which was China's project for modernization, Mao declared war on the 4 bads, which were flies, mosquitoes, rats, and sparrows, specifically the Eurasian tree sparrow. The sparrows ate seeds which had been planted and spoilt the harvest, and killing the sparrows would boost food production. So tens of millions of sparrows were killed. But the sparrows had fed not only on seeds, but also on immature locusts. And so then there was a huge plague of locusts, and the crops were devastated. And through this and other equally ill-advised decisions, somewhere between 20 and 30 million Chinese died of starvation. Now, the technique that Mao suggested for the extermination of the sparrows was a kind of mass mobilization of the peasants. They were instructed to rise before dawn with their pots and pans and bang on these pots and pans to frighten the birds out of the trees, and then to keep banging on their pots and pans whenever the flocks tried to land, so that in the end the birds would fall out of the sky with exhaustion. Now, the efficacy of this method of extermination is disputed, but the death of the sparrows and the flourishing of the locusts and of the famine is not. And the disasters of the Great Leap Forward, the disasters in many forms, but the Great Famine as the greatest one, lowered Mao's esteem and position in the party. And the Cultural Revolution can also be seen as Mao's attempt, a very successful attempt, to regain supreme position in the country. But what holds me here in the story of the Eurasian tree sparrows are the pots and pans, which is a line that jumps from China in 1958 through to Turkey in 2014, and the reports of the pots and pans being banged by protesters in the Gezi Park and Taksim Square protests, a kind of domestication of dissent in which you'd bring the domestic to confront the larger and the political. Now, to return this into the studio, because everything has to happen twice. It has to happen 2 resonances, a provocation outside in the world of an idea, and then a provocation within the materials of what happens in the studio. So here there's an invitation to work with pots and pans, with that as a sound, a kind of a soundscape to work in the in the project. It had to do with percussion, with rhythms of protest, a raw material which is waiting to be used. An outside sense of a link between the domestic and the larger political questions in the world. So then one can think of the copper or the aluminium base of the pots and pans as this membrane between the world and our own projection onto it. So it's a membrane between the people protesting and the forces of authority confronting them, almost like a kind of shield. But it's also the sound, something that comes from the world, which we can latch onto and project all sorts of other expectations and hopes onto it. So I made a note to myself, think of the different kinds of pots and pans. Should it be copper or cast iron or aluminium, a wooden spoon or a rubber spatula, a soup ladle? And together with this in the head is my image of my then 18-month-old grandson sitting on the kitchen floor with a pot and a big wooden spoon and starting his political activism from there. So we're off the wall and we're now in the center of the studio. An insistence on the face of the big idea, and this insistence is that we will be heard, we will be seen. In August of 1968, Mao was given a gift of 6 mangoes or in fact a case of mangoes, by the President of Pakistan. And this event is so peripheral that most histories of the Cultural Revolution make no mention of this gift. But Mao did not eat the mangoes. He gave the mangoes to the worker peasant Mao Zedong thought propaganda team at Beijing University. And this was a team which had been deployed to bring the students under control. So it was a small gesture, but it had huge implications. This was at the height of the student uprising in Chinese schools and university. The Red Guards, the students, were Mao's stormtroopers. They were the embodiment of his dictum, it is right to rebel. But Mao gave the mangoes not to the students, but to the workers. And so it marked the end of student power and the beginning of the repression of students when workers, which is to say, in effect, the Red Army, was given control. And this political shift was celebrated as an act of great altruism. The mangoes were preserved in wax. There were effigies of them made. They were put under glass jars and sent out to factories around China. They were constructed as floats and driven through the streets. There was a movie, there was a feature film called The Song of the Mango. They were turned into tray cloths, into mugs you can still find in flea markets in China with mangoes on them. So we again have the absurd, not the dancing on points to learn how to throw a hand grenade, but this apotheosis of a common vegetable. The transformation of an immaterial quality, in this case Mao's beneficence, into this material object of this fruit. So it's a political shift that happened in China with great consequences. Tens of thousands of students were destroyed, their lives were destroyed or disrupted. They were sent for years into the far parts of the countryside, ostensibly to learn from the peasants, but directly to stop being a nuisance in the cities. The students had served their purpose, resurrecting the power of Mao, and now they could be dispensed with. Mao could be both the force behind the students and also the force stopping them in their tracks. So here we spin out in 2 directions. We've got the politics of fruit and vegetables, which we can follow, and we can also stay around the periphery of the year 1968 to the echoes of student revolts in other parts of the world. So we should try to entertain both trajectories at the same time, but we'll first do one and then the other. 1968, and the student revolts of Paris in May 1968. Now, the student revolts in Paris were obviously not the same as the student-led revolts in China of the same year, but there were points of connection. Both tried to harness the energy of revolt among students and scholars rather than relying on the organization of the party. How, in Europe, they said, could one find a revolutionary activity that escaped the moribund straitjacket of the Stalinist communist parties of that era? In China, how could Mao reassert a continuing revolutionary role for the party and for himself. But 1968 is also the year of the revolts and reaction against the Vietnam War, which reached us even in South Africa. Why do I remember this? Not just from an abstract or inherent interest in history. In 1968, I was 13 years old. I was in Johannesburg, and I had such a strong feeling of having been born 5 years too late and in the wrong country. If I'd been 18 and in Paris or Berlin or in Berkeley, I could have been part of these extraordinary student protests. And students at the local university did have some protests at the edge of Jan Smuts Avenue in Johannesburg, but it felt a bit like the dancer in Boksburg, a statement of longing to be in a different center. I thought at the time, in 5 years' time, when I'm 18, the war in Vietnam will be over, this extraordinary possible life will have ended, I'll have missed out on it. And in the short term, I was right. Student protest had died in the mid-1970s. But of course, in the mid-1970s in South Africa, things changed enormously, and we had our own ongoing and long period of extraordinary political activity and ferment. I mean, we should be talking back about the manga, but we're going to get back to it, but let's stay in 1968 for a moment. So further edges here. So from the mangoes to 1968 to the 13-year-old in Johannesburg looking at newspaper photographs. I remember the image of Jan Palach, the Czech student who set himself alight in the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of 1968. And I remember another image which I saw of a Buddhist monk burning himself in a protest in Saigon. I'd remembered this also as 1968, but on looking it up, I see that in fact it was 1963, but I don't think I saw the photograph until 1968 or 1969. And this is Thich Quang Duc, who is a Buddhist monk, protesting over the policies of the South Vietnamese government. He sat in the road, and 4 other monks poured petrol over him, and he set himself alight. And at the time, it was such a shocking, and still is such a shocking image of commitment, of belief and commitment. How could you believe in something so strongly as to do that to yourself? But what pulled me much closer to the photo was a detail in it. The motor car behind the monk, because it was our motor car. It was an Austin Westminster A95, which was used to drive me to school every day and to drive through the night to holidays at Plettenberg Bay. I mean, this was a most respectable English car in which I would go and which the family used all along. And how could this same car be there in Saigon at the time? So a link again that went from London to Johannesburg and across the world, finding strange points of connection. But to return to the sideways look, from the sideways look at 1968, to the Chinese politics of vegetables and their representation. In China, there's been a long history of the politics of vegetables and flowers and their representation. As early as the 13th century, a painting of a stem lettuce, which was upright and tall, stood for an educated man. Bitter bamboo shoots represented good government, because a good government should be able to accept and follow difficult or bitter advice. Chinese court painters who had displeased the emperor and were sent into exile would sometimes paint things that should be white, black. So the white blossoms of a plum tree would be painted black, and this was a quiet protest at their exile. And they were known as the black painters. Other paintings of fruit and vegetables made more subtle political commentaries. If the weeds in a painting, if there were paintings of weeds which were very close to the bok choy, then it meant that the emperor was paying insufficient attention to his territories and subjects. And at the time of the Cultural Revolution, painters who didn't paint good revolutionary subjects were castigated as black painters. Their careers and the careers of their supporters amongst the nomenclatura were ended. And of course, in many cases, these fights about the artists were really clashes between different people within the party structure, and the artists were merely acceptable casualties in their battles. But there were also real arguments, and it does come back to the studio. What should the artist be painting? What should he paint? Revolutionary narrative in a familiar form, like the Beijing operas, the ballet on point, or a new way of making art in which the ostensible subject matter was never the real subject matter of the art. And for some years now, I've found that I've been painting flowers in the studio, partly for the pleasure of the activity, of transforming the petal into paper and ink, and partly as a resistance to the pressure to work on the grand ideas. So there's a pleasure of working on all these multiple sheets of paper that together will constitute the image, and what it is to blow this up into the air, and then to slowly train the sheets of paper to come back down and fall in the right places. It's about learning the grammar of the actual form. It's about accepting the studio as leading the activity and trying to find a meaning both in the technique and in what it suggests of the outside world. To do it fully, that's the subject of a second lecture, but these paintings were also obviously done in reference to the great painter of peonies and flowers, Edward Manet, the most sublime painter of petals and the softness of a flower, but also the painter of the execution of Emperor Maximilian, which places him, of course, in the company of Goya and his 3rd of May, and later on, of course, with Picasso and his Guernica. So this is a link inside the studio. How Manet painted his bunch of flowers, how he painted those extraordinary asparagus, the sheen on his foil of bottle. How he does this are all the concerns of someone busy in the actual studio with the material and technologies and techniques of representation and painting. There's a further small peripheral thought. Manet painted the execution of Emperor Maximilian in 1868 or 1869. The emperor had been sent by his Austrian family to become emperor in Mexico, and at a certain point they abandoned him, and he was captured and shot by Mexican revolutionaries in 1867. His last act before he was overthrown and shot, Emperor Maximilian, was to order from Trieste, which had been his previous home, 1,000 nightingales to fill the gardens of his garden in Mexico City. So here we have both sparrows and nightingales sitting and perching around the eaves and the windows. So to go back to Manet, we have a double link. We have to the fruits and flowers and the paintings of flowers in China and of Paris. Cultural Revolution, and Manet is the Paris Commune of 1871. Now this in 1871 was a spontaneous people's uprising during the time of the Franco-Prussian War, but it was a huge inspiration both during the Cultural Revolution in China and the student revolts of 1968. On the same streets in 1968, students pried the cobbles from the road that had been used by the communards in 1871, and the red flag of the model operas are the same as the red flags that were developed and the idea developed in Paris in 1871. And you have the 300,000 students in Tiananmen Square waving them that newspaper of 1871. Now, citizens, we remind you more than ever that we must rally around our red flag to preserve the Republic. Long live the Commune, long live the Republic. So this is 1871. And the flag is then shattered into fragments and sent to all different trajectories and histories of revolutionary activity around the world. So there's the Internationale, of course, which is heard in Paris, which gets its words later, which becomes the national anthem amongst other places of China. So we are spinning in time from 1871 to 1968, back to 1963, 2015, and in places from Johannesburg to Beijing to Paris, all of these things circling around in the studio. A central tenet of the Cultural Revolution was the transformation of the consciousness of people. This was to be achieved partly by exemplary works like the model operas, and by exemplary people, the perfect peasant, the perfect soldier, the perfect scholar, as shown in the model operas. But partly it was done through criticism and destruction of the old, and the world was divided into the good, the comparatively good, and the bad. And the bad was to be rooted out, and there were a series of things known as self-criticism struggle sessions. And there are grotesque images of people being humiliated, forced to wear sandwich boards and dunce caps proclaiming their crimes. And these, of course, have an echo with the dunce caps in Goya's etchings of people being criticized by the Inquisition, again with their crimes proclaimed on the boards they have in front of them. This dance of dunce caps, as it were, is the backstage dance, the other hidden dance of the model operas which were performed for people. The fool's cap is like an inverted megaphone. If you take a megaphone for the proclamation and expansion of sound and voices and put it on your head, it becomes both mute and its opposite. Now, the Paris Commune was crushed. There was the Semaine Sanglante, in which thousands of communards were executed. And Maximilian could have been replaced by many of the communards in Manet's painting. Karl Marx, who'd been writing about the Commune and whose earlier writings were a great inspiration to the communards, wrote of the necessary and inevitable failure of the Commune, as the proletariat, he said, was not aware of itself enough. So we're gathering again, back in the studio, the pots and pans. We've got Manet's flowers. We've got the bok choy of Chinese vegetables. We've got childhood memories. We've got the ballet shoes, and we've got the sparrows. And even during the Cultural Revolution, some of its leaders wrote of the probable defeat and the inevitable defeat and the probable imminent failure of it. The idea of failure, of probable, imminent, or necessary, take one's choice, sits on the walls of the studio, as we know from the disasters that followed that uprising. But also, inevitably, the question of hope behind the failure. Where does that leave us? Paris, China, old French colonialism, new colonialism. We put it all in motion and we have an incoherent hullabaloo. And what are the operas that could be made? Do we have an opera about, do we call up Patrice Lumumba? Do we call up Ujamaa African socialism? And we understand that this hullabaloo is in fact the center, and that cohesion is temporary. Defeat is certain but temporary. Success is certain but temporary. Hope and failure, the sparrows and the nightingales flying through the din of the pots and pans, of the edicts, of the theories, and of the private histories. Thank you. We'll end with the 8-minute film of a section of the project that was made. Sound.
masiko ogo sibona alisa yoke nungazelo manjumshabu nesekiwe sisha soyolo nakasa namasiko ogo sibona alisa yoke nungazelo manjumshabu nesekiwe sisha soyolo nakasa
公司宪法明白是民主不实，有的民主无机制，你在培养民主无机制的宪法。
Thank you.